I was born in 1948. And when I was born, my mother had to stop work. She was a civil servant in Ireland. She had married relatively late. She was in her late 20s, as was my dad. He was also a civil servant. But she had to stop work and never worked again. There were 6 of us. And that was very much the culture, or particularly the culture of in Ireland, where the Constitution actually still has a clause in it referring to women's historic role within the home. They are now looking for a referendum to get that taken out of the Constitution. So discrimination was a fact of life. You know, you weren't supposed to answer back. You weren't supposed to be too pushy. You were supposed to go to confession, tell your sins, and go home and be good. And that began to change in the 60s. It began to change for everybody. It changed more quickly in the major international cities like London than it did everywhere else. It took a much longer time in Ireland because the clergy weren't keen on having sassy women talk back to them. And so I've seen huge change, just huge change in societal attitudes over my 70 plus years. Have I ever seen overt discrimination in the workplace? No, I haven't. But my mother was, you know, a feisty lady, and we were encouraged to argue back, to speak our minds, to read, to think, to, you know, be dragged along to a political rally after one mass by my dad for one political party, and after the next mass by my mother for another political party, in the days when Irish politics was done from the back of a trailer on a tractor in the churchyard. So that's my background. I have seen discrimination, though, subsequently in my professional life. And I'm perhaps talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Stephen. I've never really had to have any views on it. You know, it's never been an issue. My mum and dad both worked when I was younger, so I never had an opinion on what any sort of gender stereotypes were or anything really with equality. I've not had that many jobs yet, but I haven't come across any sort of discrimination. So it's not something that's really, I guess I've been lucky that this hasn't come to me at all.
I think I've definitely seen change. I've kind of changed sector as I got older as well, so that makes a difference. But one of my first jobs back in the late 90s, I started work at a well-known international science laboratory, and on my first day, a very, very senior man who I was extremely intimidated by, kind of intellectually, asked me if I was the new secretary. and there's nothing wrong with being a secretary, but that wasn't the job I was in. And everyone laughed and thought it was very funny. But that was an organization where women formed 1% of the scientific workforce. So there's something about safety in numbers, isn't there? And normalization, I think, of for a certain type of maybe more old-fashioned industry about having women present and that becoming a more normal thing. But I think nowadays I don't think I've ever seen any overt discrimination since I've worked in the voluntary sector. But there are still subtle kind of institutionalized issues, I think, for women in the workplace. And one example is that women aren't very good at asking for pay rises, whereas men, and I'm generalizing massively, but I think that there's data, there's evidence that kind of plays this out, that men are more likely to ask for a pay rise. And if you ask for a pay rise, you might get it, whereas if you don't ask, you probably won't. So there's kind of structural issues there that we need to be careful of even nowadays.
I don't think I've come up, like everyone says, I think I'm aware of it, I'm aware of what goes on, but myself has never actually been the sort of a focus point of any discrimination. I was brought up very much that my dad was the breadwinner and my mum stayed at home, but that's because she was a foster carer, so I suppose her workplace was in the home. that's the way I've been brought up. I've got 3 older brothers. I was the youngest. I was the only girl, so it was kind of expected of me to do the chores around the house, and you know, and I never once questioned, you know, why it was always my turn to do the dishes or set the table. That was just, I suppose, maybe my parents were old-fashioned, and yeah, and I think I'm probably, you know, this is my 54th year, and I'm probably just starting to realise that it's not always necessarily the woman's role to be the housekeeper, if you like. So it's probably still changing my views.
Oh, brilliant.